the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jim Flink. This week, we are looking at the state of free press in Myanmar. Since transitioning to a democratic government in 2011, the country formerly known as Burma has been working to improve conditions for journalists living and working in that country. The country recently hosted a conference on free press issues where journalists from all over the world met to discuss Myanmar's gains in improving press freedom, as well as what's still left to be done. It should be noted journalists in Myanmar are still being put in jail for doing their jobs, just as they were under the military junta that ruled the country for nearly 50 years. Reporters Without Borders describes the state of press freedom in Myanmar as, quote, a very serious situation, end quote. Earlier this year, police detained 4 journalists in the northern part of the country for reporting on the alleged construction of a chemical weapons factory. We wonder, have things actually gotten better for the press? Joining us on Global Journalist to discuss the state of journalism in Myanmar, Ethan Zuckerman, the director of MIT's Center for Civic Media, Maureen Aung Thuan, director of the Burma Project at the Open Society Foundations, and Glenn Van Zutphen, the founder of Van Media Group, a media constituency, or rather consultancy firm based in Singapore. And thank you to all of you for joining us today on Global Journalist.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Now, all of our guests attended that press freedom conference in Myanmar, as did a team from Global Journalist. One of the highlights of the conference was a speech by Burmese opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who addressed the role of the press and how it plays out in a developing democracy.
Many people have talked about the amazing changes that have taken place in this country. And I would like to say quite frankly that these changes have been not all that great and not all that amazing. But there is one thing that none of us can deny. There is greater freedom of the press. Now, when people talk about freedom in the political sense, I've always said you must never separate freedom from responsibility. If you talk about greater freedom, you must talk about greater responsibility as well. And this applies to the media, to the press. Greater freedom demands greater responsibility if this freedom is not to be misused.
And so let's start with you, Ethan Zuckerman. The tone of what Aung San Suu Kyi said was interesting in and of itself, in that she sounded not so much like a former opposition leader or activist, but a little bit more like an insider, did she not?
Well, I think she certainly has made the shift to being an outside opposition activist to being a very powerful political force in the country. But I actually read something slightly different in that statement. I think the media in Myanmar is going through a really interesting set of shifts very, very quickly. And I think there's almost what you might characterize as a moral panic around a much freer press and particularly an open online space. Almost every conversation I had about the internet in Myanmar, or about press freedom in Myanmar, ended up talking about these problems of hate speech, of extreme speech. And one of the things that I heard Aung San Suu Kyi talking about was this sort of question of responsibility. To Western ears, responsibility often sounds like code for let's find ways to keep censoring the press, let's find ways of putting a very clear circle around the press. But there's also totally legitimate concerns about extreme speech, both in the media and in online media in Myanmar. And I think it's worth remembering that we've had changes go on in this country in the last 2 years that really took 20 years in most of the rest of the world. And these questions about whether people can speak completely freely online and what are their responsibilities when they're speaking freely online, those can be very, very scary questions. And that's really what I heard Dasu making reference to.
And Glenn Van Zutphen, we talked about this just before the start of the show, about the sort of importance of a historical context for a free press in order for it to sort of work out without lots of kinks in it, yes?
Well, absolutely, and I would certainly defer to many of the comments that Ethan just mentioned. His depth of knowledge in this field is unquestioned, and I'm not saying that because I want to go to MIT or anything, but really he knows a lot of stuff. One thing I think is really interesting, and perhaps we can talk about this a little bit more throughout the course of the show, is this the new printers and publishers registration bill that was passed in the Myanmar parliament this month. Now, just on the 17th of March, the Committee to Protect Journalists wrote a letter to the president of Myanmar asking him to please veto this bill, because the bill has some elements to it that I think Ethan referenced, outlawing the publication of material that insults religion, quote unquote, disturbs the rule of law, incites unrest, violates the Constitution, harms ethnic unity. And these are all very loaded phrases. Now, of course, I think probably most journalists would agree that it wouldn't be good for these things to happen. The question lies, who's the arbiter of that? Who decides what is inciting what? And then what is the punishment or the selective selective punishment that might befall a journalist who happens to cross that line, whatever that line is determined to be. So the country is in some very interesting waters right now. They come out of such a long history of state-run media, and all of a sudden, under the glare of everybody around the world, they're having to become a free and fair press, and it's a tough challenge.
And Maureen Ongthuan, can you give us a little bit of historical context about the hate speech? Because there are some very divergent groups in Burma that make this a very legitimate concern. Can you give us a little historical context?
Well, this is my opinion anyway. The historical context is that for centuries, for decades, and certainly for a very long time, Burma's been a very plural society. There's been different religions, even though the Buddhism is more or less the primary religion. It's almost, I would say, over 90% of the people are Buddhists, Theravada Buddhists. But Muslims and Hindus and Christians and Sikhs, everybody, atheists, animists, they've all been living together. But you see, under an authoritarian regime, if you do have any problems with not the religion so much, but maybe the South Asians are overly disproportionately presented in the economy, and you think that, they're taking your jobs away or whatever, as during the British colonial days when labor was brought in really by the probably by millions. I mean, Rangoon at one point was a South Asian city. But they never had this kind of they never had access to this kind of freedom of expression as in platforms like Facebook and all that before that technology was available. So I don't know how much of it is just just an evolution of when things get freer and you can speak your mind, and how long that's been there. But what's very disturbing is that it seems to be some concerted efforts by some people or some groups to sort of provoke this kind of hostility, I would say, and that's a very new thing, and I'm not quite sure how we deal with that, because people are scared, and they're scared because they haven't had information. So throughout history, they've never been able to get their own information, and then everyone tends to believe, as in rumors and superstitions, and so there's a lot of things going against clarifying that even the real information could clarify the atmosphere.
The sheer numbers of new players in media, does that complicate things even more so, Ethan?
Well, it's been incredible to watch the rapid flowering of the media scene, particularly around newspapers. So for many, many years, it wasn't possible to run a daily newspaper in Myanmar because there was pre-publication censorship. So you basically had to have your content reviewed by the authorities before you could publish it, which meant putting out a daily was not possible. But Myanmar is an incredibly literary society. This is a society where, as you walk the streets of Yangon, bookstores are one of the most frequent things you see. And so there are hundreds of weekly and monthly publications, and there's been a huge flourishing of daily publications. but probably more than can currently be supported by the current advertising revenue for the country. So one of the things that we heard a great deal about at the East-West Society Conference was people starting daily newspapers and almost immediately running into financial trouble. So I think we're probably going to see a rapid blooming and then some sort of compression of the market. The other thing that I suspect we'll see is that Myanmar is really just now opening up to the internet. And what's happening for most countries that are sort of late to get on the internet, as Myanmar is they get on via the mobile phone. Mm-hmm. And the mobile phone market in Myanmar has been massively underdeveloped. It's been really badly constrained by government policies, but we believe that's changing. And we sort of hope that late this year, we may start seeing millions of people in the country come onto mobile phone networks. That may in turn change the press equation. It may be possible to run a successful daily newspaper that is a hybrid between print and online. And in fact, I think that the companies that are going to be most successful are the ones that figure out how to take on sort of online advertising and sort of break into that market early.
And clearly, it's very difficult in any place on the planet to be running a profitable print organization in this day and age. So that sort of lends even more credence to that. Glenn, you know, were you surprised at all? I was taken with the sheer numbers of people that attended this conference and with the amount of reporting that was coming out of it. Were you surprised at all by that?
Jim, that's a great question. I had the chance to. I was a fellow at the East-West Center in 2002, and so my connection with them, the conference organizers, goes back a number of years. And not only is it an amazing organization for those of your viewers who don't know about it, but get on their website. They're based on the campus of the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and their ability to bridge East and West is really unrivaled in the Asia Pacific region because they've been an honest broker in that process since 1960 when the East-West Center was started. To my point, I had a chance to talk at length with Susan Kreifels and Karen Knudsen, who are from the East-West Center, and they were the ones who actually put this program together along with a very dedicated staff there. But they said to me, you know, we started this process 2 years ago with the government in Myanmar, and they did not put one restriction on the East-West Center in terms of what could be covered, how it could be covered, what they wanted the conference to do or not do. And all throughout the conference, they were just shaking their heads in disbelief that here we were with, you know, over 350 journalists from both inside Myanmar and also outside around the region and around the world in the country, reporting on pretty much whatever they wanted to, and in a way that was really quite surprising. Just one more point, and that was the Deputy Minister of Information and the presidential spokesman formally addressed the group 2 times. One was a keynote speech, and the other time he was on a panel, and he stuck around to answer questions, and he was not afraid to take any question from the floor. They were not filtered. They were not, they were not in any way altered. So it was quite interesting. Now, is that to say that the government still doesn't have a long way to go? Absolutely. And I'm sure, as Maureen would attest, there's so much happening with coverage or lack of coverage in some of the ethnic conflict stuff that's happening with the Rakhine state and all. So that does need to be addressed for sure. But it was really surprising to, I would say, all of us that we had the kind of freedom and access that we did.
And interestingly, we do have a clip that we want to go to here momentarily from the Deputy Minister of Information. But first, a reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. And today we are looking at the state of press freedom in Myanmar. Joining us on the program today, Ethan Zuckerman, the director of MIT's Center for Civic Media, Maureen Ong Thuyen, the director of the Burma Project at the Open Society Foundations, and Glenn Van Zutphen, the founder of the Van Media Group, a media consultancy firm that is based in Singapore. So we want to go to that clip from Uyi Phut, who was talking about press freedom in Myanmar.
Minister of Information, vision in our media reform is very simple. We want to implement UNESCO Media Development Indicator in our country media sector. In the past 3 years, we have some success. The first most important change is we abolished censorship system in 2012. Because of these changes, in 2013, first time in the over 50 years, the private daily newspaper are emerging in our country. Now people have freely to discuss political, social, and economic issues on the media. Now we are starting to transform the state-owned media to the public service media. It is a media that empowers citizens to make the informed decisions required to achieve democratic transition in our country.
Marine Ong Thuen, give us a little context here. Here is the government talking to this international gathering. What do we read into that?
Well, Uyatut is a very polished spokesperson. He's very charming. His English is one of the best among the government officials. And he's not scared to say whatever he wants to, like in a very forceful, straightforward way. But he doesn't. He sometimes spins things, though. You know, when he's been quoted saying X did not happen when there were, say, eyewitnesses to. I'm talking now about some serious violence that happened quite recently. He just said, "Well, it didn't happen." So I'm glad that he came, and we are good friends with him, and that he sat through the whole conference in the front row and listened, which is, I think, is something I wish more of the government people would. He's a good spokesman for them, but I would like, if I were given the choice of what I would do for the government, is they all need to also get used to free press themselves. That is, they shouldn't be so intimidated or scared by being criticized. Even though there is criticism then, in the press, they've been reacting to it in recent days, I think, in sort of in ways that remind us of the former regime. They'll say things like, "Oh, they when they arrested the Unity journalist for the chemical plant story,
Right.
They said national security." Well, that's so vague and ambiguous, and it comes from a colonial rule of 1923, and that's really like the old days. So the context is they're evolving too.
And Ethan, to that issue, is there a fear now that with sort of that military junta background sort of always looming, that there will be more self-censorship by these media members, that they won't necessarily wait for the government to censor them?
Well, I think there's all sorts of layers that we worry about on this. I think when we look at something like the Unity Journal case, it's become clear that certain stories are going to land you into trouble. And that at the moment where the government is able to sort of invoke state security while denying that there was actually a chemical weapons factory found, this starts feeling a lot like sort of Orwellian doublespeak. And certainly there are going to be some publications that aren't willing to sort of take the risk associated with that. I think what would get really disturbing is whether under this new legislation, coverage of ethnic conflict ends up being censored in similar ways, or sort of self-censored for fear that if you stray too far in that direction, you might find yourself incarcerated, as 4 reporters and the CEO of that publication have found themselves. I would mention there's another layer of this that I'm very worried about, which is this is a country that has historically had very strong state-run media. That state-run media is trying to figure out what it can do next. And the idea that's been put forward by Uyatut and others is the idea that it might become public service media. And, on the one hand, you have to sort of admire the aspiration of trying to turn a propaganda machine into something that could actually effectively inform the people. On the other hand, that is certainly not best practice for how you build public service journalism. And it's going to be very, very hard for people to believe that public service journalism is coming out of a publication like the New Light of Myanmar. So I'm worried that what we could see if we're not careful is a resurgence of propaganda masquerading as public service journalism and an increasing timidity from independent media as they start worrying about crossing red lines, some of which are explicit and some of which are implicit.
Glenn, you talked
Ethan,
a
if I
little
could
bit
just,
about. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, Jim, if I could just add on to that point. One of the things I do in my consultancy, I've been a career journalist for 28 years, and one of the things that I do now is go into countries around Southeast Asia and train their early and mid-career journalists, many of whom in their own countries have come out of this state-run media propaganda model, and many of which have been privatized in the recent years or even recent decades. And one of the things I see, again and again, is what I call a hangover from the former days when it was just pushing out all the good news of the government and hiding all the bad. I believe that there will be a natural progression where Myanmar has to go through this searching of what its media wants to be, and some media will stay, I think, favorable toward the government or toward national interests, and others will not. Interestingly, there have been many international organizations in Myanmar training journalists in what we would consider to be a Western model of journalistic practice for a number of years now. I'll be going there a little bit later this year to do some training as well. But there are a lot of really, really good and dedicated Westerners trying to help Burmese journalists understand, some of the techniques and the concepts and theories behind how to cover stories in a way that would perhaps hold truth to power a little bit more than what had been done in the past.
Back to that issue of the concern over hate speech and maybe of opening the spigot on sort of a free flow of information too quickly, Maureen. To the issue of the Rohingya and that situation that Glenn mentioned earlier, is that a legitimate concern that too much information, too free a flow of information, particularly in this day and age of social media, where it is more difficult once you free up the process to maybe restrict it? Is that a legitimate concern from the government's point of view?
I think from the government's point of view, it is a legitimate concern, and whatever media goes out, I mean, they would like to still, as both the gentlemen were saying, would like to control it. Ethan and I have had a lot of discussions on this, whether the hate speech, because we're trying to address it as well as a foundation, for Burma. Should it be like monitored and censored or zapped when it gets really awful, or should there just be more speech and try to encourage moderates and people who have something good to say, which is a problem right now. You're not finding a lot of Burmese writing publicly about the Rohingya, and they won't even say the word Rohingya because the government and many Burmese, and I hate to say most of the country, there's this thing resonates with them for whatever reason, fear, historical reasons. So the government has said this Rohingya does not exist. They never were an ethnic group, even though they say they've been there for centuries, and there are historical records. But history is, of course, very contested, and you can interpret it as you want. So it's a big problem how to deal with it. What I'm also concerned about is in the days of this day of 24/7 news cycles and citizen journalism and always having to fill the waves, whatever waves, cyberspace, that people are taking a lot of stuff from Facebook and then sticking it straight into the newspapers and journals. In fact, whole articles became articles was somebody's rant on Facebook. Well, of course, they were ranting about us, by the way, so I know where it came from. So, that's of concern because, so how does, so one has to, how does one tackle that, Say you can't take things from Facebook to rerun, but maybe you should source it and say where it came from. In any case, we haven't gotten our heads around how to deal with this. Ethan has some good ideas.
Yeah, and Ethan, the government has enlisted the support of Deutsche Welle somewhat, maybe not uncontroversially, to coin a new phrase, in terms of maybe giving some guidelines, yes?
So I don't know much about Deutsche Welle's involvement. I do know that this problem that Maureen talks about is going to be one that that Myanmar is dealing with for a long time. Because, again, remember, we've had 20 years of the commercial web in the US, in the UK, in much of Southeast Asia, to get used to this idea that just because something's online doesn't mean that it's valid. And we're now sort of wrestling with this, as Maureen described it, at sort of a moment of the perfect storm. You have daily newspapers that are really desperate for content because they're trying to figure out how to be viable and how to get things out the door. You have the Myanmar government doing the right thing, which is getting rid of pre-press censorship. You have long-standing ethnic tension. And suddenly people able to talk about that in different media. In some cases, that was resentment or tension that was very difficult for people to articulate, and now there is a space to articulate it. And then throw on top of it this whole question of how do you verify anything that you're seeing online. So, we can talk about this. Obviously, it's absolutely correct, as Glenn said, that we need to do good journalism training, and particularly journalism training for how we deal with online media. We also have to think in the long term about new media literacy. How do we help people understand what they want to read online, how to take it seriously, how to triangulate, things that we're still teaching in the US to get there. The trick is this is all sort of wrapped together, and we're going to be dealing with it all sort of simultaneously and all at the same time. And it wouldn't be at all surprising to see one or more instances of really extreme speech show up online and see a really strong push to regulate online speech. And I think that's where all the international partners that really want to see Myanmar succeed, really want to see an open media environment in Myanmar, have to sort of raise our hands and say, look, there are better and worse ways to do this. And you really don't want to do blanket censorship of something like Facebook. And if you're going to do any sort of content control on Facebook, you want to do it from civil society, you want to do it on a voluntary basis, you want to do it on sort of exposing and shaming people engaged in hate speech. You certainly don't want to do it centralized from the government, because it becomes another form of censorship and another form of speech control.
And that will have to be our final word. That is all for this edition of Global Journalist, produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Joining us today on the program, Ethan Zuckerman, the director of MIT Center for Civic Media; Maureen Ong Thuyn, the director of the Burma Project at the Open Society Foundations; and Glenn Van Zutphen, who is the founder of the Van Media Group, a media consultancy firm based in Singapore. Thanks once again to all of you for joining us today on Global Journalist. Our executive producer today is Casey Morrell, our lead producer, Victoria Nkute. Join us again next time for another edition of Global Journalist as we discuss yet another issue affecting journalists across the globe. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jim Flink.